Now please join me in welcoming our first keynote speaker, Samuel S. Visner, the Director of National Cybersecurity Federally Funded Research and Development Center, NCF, at MITRE. In his role, Sam oversees efforts to bring together experts from industry, government, and academia to demonstrate integrated cybersecurity solutions are cost-effective, repeatable, and scalable. The FFRDC is the first of its kind dedicated to cybersecurity. Sam joined MITRE from an executive position at ICF International, which advises business and government entities on issues related to health, homeland security, defense, and energy. He also held leadership positions at CSC, Computer Sciences Corporation, and Science Applications International Corporation, SAIC. Thank you for joining us.
And I see that the AV system decided to malfunction in my honor. Well, I'm this morning's entertainment, sad to say. And just like church or synagogue, the front row, of course, is empty in case the preacher should decide to visit wrath on you, but I won't, I promise. And I'll try to keep things moving. And the reason I say I'm your morning's entertainment is that not only am I supposed to kick this thing off and say something that hopefully is at least mildly entertaining or useful, but then I'm to moderate the subsequent panel. So about half the audience is going to be up here in a few minutes as my panelists. So I really am the carnival barker today. Before I get into the usual prepared pitch, I want to tell you a little bit about how I got to where I am and why I'm doing what I'm doing. My story is a little unusual because the one thing that wasn't mentioned in that bio is that I was, among other things, the chief of signals intelligence programs at the National Security Agency. And many years ago, when I was half my age, I was a young signals intelligence officer over at CIA. So I've been involved in the issue of cyber for a very long time, one way or the other, either trying to defend networks or, frankly, in the case of our nation's adversaries and others, trying to exploit their networks. So for me, this has been a very long voyage. And I've seen a couple of changes. And one of the changes that I've seen is the nature of cyberspace itself. And that led me over time through a number of long detours to the job I'm doing right now. And the nature of cyberspace is one that I would say affects the people in this room because we're operating in an environment, in my opinion, and as they always like to say, your mileage may vary, particularly in online fora. But my mileage is such that I've seen a change in cyberspace that has created an environment in which we operate that is, in some ways, really a lot different than we thought it was. For Americans, cyberspace, the place where we operate our networks, is essentially an environment in which we use electromagnetic energy to move information. And starting in the 1950s and eventually the 60s and 70s and up till now, we learned how to use electromagnetic energy not only to move information but to store and process it, which information scientists call the unity of information in motion, which is communication, and the information at rest, which is essentially referential database information. And we learned to create a cyberspace that has both referential information, databases, and information systems, as well as the communications necessary, the information in motion. But for us, for Americans, cyberspace remained and remains essentially a medium in which we are moving information around using electromagnetic energy. And when we use the term cyberspace, we are talking about cybersecurity, when we use that term cybersecurity, we're talking about protecting information that in fact is being stored and managed and moved around using electromagnetic energy. Cybersecurity is mostly about protecting information. It's about privacy. It's about making sure that healthcare information is safeguarded, the information necessary to manage the power grid is safeguarded, the information necessary to keep my credit card information away from my in-laws is kept safe. Not an entirely secure, not an entirely successful endeavor, I gather. But that's what it's about. And we tend to view it from this perspective. That is not cyberspace as everybody else sees it. And there's been a change. And the problem is that we, those of us in our practice, in our discipline, we see cyberspace in the way I principally just described it. But that's not how everybody sees it. And I'm going to get into the more prosaic and frankly sort of less interesting and maybe even less entertaining, but probably more useful to you part of this in a minute. But since I'm not being paid, I can say what I want, right? And I'm no longer part of the government, so unless I embarrass my employer at MITRE, hopefully I can really say what I want. Cyberspace is not that way for everybody. In the early 1990s, there was an interesting article, and it was entitled "Welcome to Cyberia," C-Y-B-E-R-A, by an anthropologist named Escobar. And he said, you know, cyberspace is going to create a different kind of human society. And he said it's time to start thinking about what we call cyber anthropology, which is how human beings are going to be shaped, what's going to change their culture, how cyberspace is going to change culture, how it's going to change societies, what we're going to have to do to take a look at changes overall in human behavior. This is not just going to move information around, it's going to have an effect on society. And we need to think about how changes in human behavior and culture will take place. If you ever read this article, which you can find online, my guess is unless you are a professional academic, and although I teach as an adjunct at Georgetown, I'm not a professional academic. This thing is turgid and written in academic language, and it's almost impenetrable. But if you can claw your way through it, as one might, what he said is it's time for people who study society to ask what are the effects of this new environment that we just thought was about moving around electromagnetic energy and information, what are the effects on human beings? So that's one big change. The other big change occurred when other countries realized that in fact the internet and cyberspace was going to become as active as it is, and that people were going to be interacting there routinely. And they said cyberspace is not an environment for the movement of information using electromagnetic energy. It's an environment that we need to govern, we need to control, we need to make sovereign. And I'll tell you how this sort of came about in my own thinking and then where it really went. Who here remembers the Arab Spring? So the Arab Spring actually took most of us by surprise, and I can tell you I was serving on the Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance Task Force of the Defense Science Board at the time. That's rather a mouthful. And we were thinking about intelligence requirements for counterinsurgency, and this thing broke out, and boy, did it take us by surprise. And so everybody thought about the Arab Spring and the revolution in Tahrir Square in Egypt, and they said, wow, the internet made that possible. People were tweeting, people were using the internet, people were texting. This is how the opposition became organized. And paper after paper and speech after speech was written about this, which is great. I was teaching at Georgetown at the time, and in a subsequent semester, one of my students, who is clearly a lot brighter than I am, decided to write a paper about how the internet caused the Arab Spring to be successful. And I thought it would probably be a good paper, but I also thought a lot of people are writing this paper, and oh, by the way, we still don't have a lot of data, we have a lot of opinions. Or as somebody once said, the plural of anecdote doesn't actually equal evidence. This is a phrase that some of you may have heard. So she wrote her paper, and she did her class presentation based on it, and she did not write that paper. Instead, she wrote a different paper, and she wrote a better paper. And she wrote, and she made a point that, you know, in retrospect was absolutely obvious, but I didn't see it. I didn't see it coming. And she said the Egyptian government realized far too late that people were using cyberspace to communicate and organize the opposition to the government, to Mubarak's government. They didn't realize cyberspace even existed as a domain. These were, generals and bureaucrats living in Egypt in their 70s and 80s. For them, this barely existed. If they needed a computer, they would ask somebody in the outer office to type something on a computer. They didn't use this technology. And so when they realized what was happening, they did something interesting. And this is an interesting story. And again, we still need more data. They said, by God, if these people are going to use the internet and use text and Twitter to communicate and organize as an opposition, I know what we'll do. We'll shut it down. We'll shut it down. We'll shut it down. Great move. So what happened? If this is making them powerful, we'll make them powerless. We will take away their superpowers, right? This will be the kryptonite. And according to my student, and I think she's right, although this could use more research, it did not make them powerless. It made them angry. They use this every day for dealing with family affairs, running their small businesses, handling transactions, transfers of money from abroad to Egyptian families at home, for commercial exchanges, to run their social groups, to run their social life. This was not a luxury. This was just a fact of life. It was like water. It was like somebody saying, I'm going to turn off your water. And it actually made more people angry than it made them helpless. And it packed more crowds into Tahrir Square and probably contributed to the overthrow of that government. I think that was an interesting moment in the evolution of cyberspace, which is maybe a little bit different from the cyberspace in which we think we're operating. Well, other people realized this. And so in 2009, our good friends in China and Russia drafted a treaty called the Shanghai Accord. By the way, we didn't sign this. And they came up with a new definition of cyberspace. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about it because it's actually important to the story of why I'm giving this talk today. And in their definition of cyberspace, which I think is just absolutely amazing, they don't talk about the protection of information, not a bit of it. Healthcare information, financial information, they don't care. Privacy doesn't show up. In their definition of cybersecurity, the word privacy does not appear. What does appear? Cybersecurity is about protecting in cyberspace the sovereign prerogatives of the governments of these countries from illegitimate social, political, religious, and other influences. Cyberspace has to be governed to protect the sovereign prerogatives of governments. And cyberspace is sovereign territory. It can be conquered, it can be controlled, and it can be governed, it can be made sovereign. And therefore, when we're operating in cyberspace, we're operating in an environment that we think is for the use of electromagnetic information, to move information around and manage information. And other people operate in cyberspace. It's about an environment in which human conduct is managed and governed and controlled in such a way that the government can expand its sovereign prerogatives. So when the cyberspace in which we're operating, in which you're operating today, in which I'm operating, I think it's one thing. But there are others, particularly those in China and Russia, and I'm not calling them villains. I'm just telling you how, I'm just acting as an old intelligence officer. I'm giving you a report, not making a policy recommendation. Intelligence officers are not supposed to make policy recommendations. God forbid they should ever do that, or that it would ever happen. Ever. Well, all right. Almost never. But the point is that we're operating in an environment that other countries believe is sovereign. So if you take a look at healthcare information, for us, it's information to be safeguarded. For them, it's information that is used to preserve the sovereign power of their government. That's a very different kind of cyberspace. The problem is we're operating in that same cyberspace, and we don't always know that. And so eventually you ask, why did a national security geek like me end up in sort of working in support of cybersecurity for mostly the private sector, which is where I'm operating? And that's the mission of the center that I run. And the answer is because I think we're all operating in the same cyberspace, but I don't think we know what that cyberspace looks like as our adversaries view it. That's sort of the reason I got to this point. And I thought I would give you that rather than give you the usual preamble because, you know, it's turning into a nice spring Tuesday morning and you'd probably rather be outside wandering around D.C. Than listening to some boring old guy. But I thought I would tell you this because, in fact, it is a new reality. So before I wanted to give you that, then I'm going to move with some speed through this. I've always been told that you should try to get your bottom line up front or your bluff, right? Who uses that term? If you've been in the government, that term is unavoidable. And I'd like always to be able to tell my story without PowerPoint, but this is Washington, and I think they've passed a law that requires PowerPoint in any room with more than 6 people. Is that right? Never forget, though, anybody from Microsoft here? Power corrupts, but PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. All right. So let me tell you a little bit about what we do. Every federally funded research and development center is sponsored by 7 of the nation's 42 FFRDCs. Who here knows what are the special qualities of the number 42? Life, the universe, and everything. The rest of you, if you've not read the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, that is your homework assignment. And believe me, it's good fun. Douglas Adams is a funny guy. We are the first federally funded research and development center devoted specifically to cybersecurity. And like every FFRDC, we have a sponsor. Our sponsor is the National Institute of Standards and Technologies National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, which I think is quite a mouthful, the NIST NCCOE. And their mission is interesting and unusual. And it goes back to sort of the history of what NIST was all about before it even became NIST and it was the National Bureau of Standards. And let me tell you, this is a fairly rigorous organization. I mean, how many organizations have the word standards in their middle name, right? You know, we know how things ought to work because we set the standard. Well, the old National Bureau of Standards and now NIST had a job of making sure that standards were established, that all of industry could use them, and also building what are called reference architectures. Here's how to build a blast furnace. You don't have to build it this way, but this is an example of doing it right. And if you do it, it will make steel of the following standards. And if we find a new and innovative technology, we'll see if it can fit into this reference architecture so that this technology can be adopted nationwide. So the idea was to adopt innovative technologies nationwide at scale, and also to drive the use of those technologies in the direction of achieving whatever standard was applicable to an industry, whether it be making steel or making healthcare. That's the job that NIST has had since before any of us were born, and it was the National Bureau of Standards. Roll the tape, CD, MP3 file forward to about 2012, and we are now faced with a plethora, with an explosion of cybersecurity technologies. And these technologies come in many different flavors. They tend to be expensive. Some are hard to use. Some are harder to use than others. Some work together, some don't. At the same time, every industry, including healthcare, is being hit with new standards to achieve. So you have an ever-changing threat environment, an evolving set of standards you have to meet, and a very dynamic, turbulent environment of products and technologies that you can apply to meet these standards and deal with this threat environment, which is interesting. Now, I see our friends General Dynamics are meeting downstairs. They have resources. But what about small and medium-sized companies or smaller and medium-sized agencies? How do they handle this? This is not a problem in which to which we can devote unlimited resources. So NIST does what NIST does. And they did so with the urging and support of then Senator Barbara Mikulski of Maryland. Anybody ever work with Barbara Mikulski? If she thought something was a good idea, the people around her also thought it was a good idea. It was safer that way. Worked out well. It worked out much better. And they said, look, for small and medium-sized businesses, starting with those that we call essentially Presidential Policy Directive 21 industries, but going beyond that to, consumer, to retail, and to hospitality, we're going to assemble reference architectures of commercial cybersecurity technologies in ways that will work. And we're doing several of those in healthcare. So the talk that I want to, the comments that I'm making right now, in essence, are a way of saying to you, our job is to take an architectural approach to the various industries in which we work, which include healthcare. And if you haven't been up to the center in Rockville, Maryland, it's available to you. You don't need a passport or a visa to get there. It is part of the Washington area. Just remember it's 270, which is always fun to drive. And their job, our job, is to develop reference architectures of practical technologies, affordable technologies, and they all have to be commercially available. Nowhere in those architectures, and they're all online at nist.nccoe.gov, nist.nccoe.gov, nowhere in those architectures can there be a block that says, and in here, insert the technology from the National Security Agency that you're not cleared to use that costs billions of dollars and is far too complex for you anyway. You can't do that. Everything has to be commercial. So that's what we do. All right, I've given you most of the speech, but I'll go through it, and I'll even try to keep us more or less on time. So we're a collaborative hub, and we do bring together people from government, from industry, from academia. It's part of NIST, and it is and our center, which is called the National Cybersecurity Federally Funded Research and Development Center. We try to build partnerships, and we really do. I mean, and to give you a sense of this, we're always working with policy people. We don't set policy, but our job is to understand what policy and standards are. We work with a lot of product vendors. We've signed, over 200 cooperative research and development agreements with over 100 different companies, which I think is pretty impressive. We don't set standards. Other parts of NIST do, and standards are set in industry. Our job is to develop architectures that help people achieve those standards. We work with the federal government mostly, but sometimes with state and local governments. And we work with academia. We have a group of universities called the Academic Affiliates Council, and we work actively with them, and they participate in the development of these architectures. We have quite an impressive infrastructure of some 23 labs. And we do everything from working on healthcare issues like the security of picture archiving, the security of patient records using mobile devices, and my very favorite, medical devices that are connected to human beings on the one hand and to the hospital's IT on the other, which is in essence our proxy for all connected devices. We have something like 90% of the national market in infusion pumps up in our lab. And as you may know, those infusion pumps did not have any security features. They're connected to the hospital IT through a password. So building an architecture with compensating controls that would allow the more secure use of these kinds of connected devices was one of our most interesting challenges. Either I've gone ahead here. We have a very simple model. Working with industry, working with government, working with product vendors, we define a problem. We assemble a team of government people, NIST people, MITRE people, and industry people from the product vendors, as well as from those industries that are going to use these products. We build an architecture, and then I have a very active team of people doing outreach and engagement. And since they have to do it, I do it too, and that's one of the reasons that I'm here. Everything we do has to be standards-based. If we're working in healthcare, or we're working in finance, or we're working in energy, then it has to help somebody achieve the standards applicable to their industry. And it's got to be modular. If you say, well, I don't want to use this tool, I don't like it, or I have a license to use a different tool, our view is fine. Pull that one out, put yours in. Just remember, it has to be able to help you achieve the same standards and have the functionality that we define in the architecture. People have to be able to see what we've done and repeat it and build it themselves. Every technology has to be available commercially. It's got to be usable. It can't be too expensive. And it's got to be open and transparent. People have to be able to look into the architecture and make this work. And by the way, I'm going to leave these slides, so you're all welcome to have them, assuming our friends at ACT-IAC will be kind enough to distribute them and make them available to you. We document this, because we don't set standards, and standards tend to be voluntary. particularly in cybersecurity. We call them practice guides. And if there was a more boring term to use to describe a publication than a practice guide, I don't know what it is. But if you find one, we'll use it, I'm sure. And the practice guides are really a how-to. And the how-to consists of a volume A, which is sort of for those of us who are not engineers, here's the problem we're trying to solve, here's why it gets solved, this is how it's done, but at a high level. Volume B tracks, not only shows you how to build it, but it actually maps everything in there to whatever controls and standards are applicable to the environment in which, the industry in which you're working. And Volume C takes you right down to the glue code necessary to make the products work together. And it's all available online. And by the way, they're available as they're under development too. So drafts are available. You can comment on them as much as you like. Clearly, my fat fingers are not working. And although, you know, we've been around, we opened our center in 2014, I think we've got a heck of a portfolio. It's pretty active. If it's in an orange number, it's been published as what's called a NIST special publication in the 1800 series. So for those of you who are NIST geeks, you will recognize their number series. And you get a sense of the work that's been done. It goes from many, it encompasses many different industries, and it encompasses many different problems. And there are problems that I never really thought about before. For example, the hospitality industry, you know, you check into a hotel, you're in essence, there's a record about you that's linked everywhere from your loyalty card, through your payment information, through where you have reserved and where you've stayed, all the way down to the application that they've loaded on your phone so that you can unlock your door. So there's a ton of PII available through those systems, and the security of those systems has turned out to be a really, really big deal. Some of what we do, by the way, cuts across industries. We're looking at derivative credentials. We're working on data integrity, which I think is exciting, and I wish our friends in Atlanta had been using that architecture. It might have saved them a whole lot of grief when they were hit with ransomware called, and I consider this personally unfortunate, SamSam. I just think that's unfair. It should have been called Ralph or something. I'm going to try and get this right. Some of the projects we do cross sectors, and these are the ones that we've done so far. We have others in development. This list is always at least one rev behind. And these are the industries in which we've been working. As I said, we've been doing 3 in healthcare. One that's under development right now is essentially for the security of picture archiving, which, as you all know better than I do, although I'm getting old enough that I'm now being exposed to this more personally, there is a lot of medical imagery that's being created and has to be secured. That one is underway. The work that we've published practice guides, reference architectures for securing patient records through mobile devices, and the one that we've done with connected devices using infusion pumps. So, if you're interested, you're certainly welcome to come up to Rockville. We get a lot of support from industry. A project called, an aspect of this called the National Cybersecurity Excellence Partnership meets quarterly, and these are companies that advise us on the state of the industry, try to advise us on where technology is going. We also work not only with NIST, but with other parts of the government. We're working now with the Department of Transportation. We're starting to work on connected cars and the technology for smart cities. We've been working on building up a standard model for cyber investigation and forensics with our friends in the Department of Defense. And we've been doing a lot of the architecture work for the next generation of continuous diagnostics and mitigation. The thing that I think my little team does really well is we are really good systems architects. They're very good at applying an architecture of cybersecurity technologies to an overarching architecture of information technology. And a lot of the work that they're doing now involves building reference architectures for cloud-based implementations as well. So I think that's pretty cool. And it's a relatively small group. This is less than 100 people. And I'd like to say that they work really hard. We're really easy to find. I have an office up in Rockville, and I have an office at the MITRE mothership Death Star in Tyson's Corner. My newly appointed technical director is Brian Abey, and we're available, as our wives have learned, about 24/7. So that mostly keeps us on time. I think we have time for a couple of questions before we segue into the panel. But as we get ready, I want to leave you with this. We are trying to move beyond point solutions. If somebody comes to us and says, what should I use? Should I use, God, I don't want to offend anybody. Should I use ArcSight or should I use QRadar? Our view is you can go to Gartner or IDC or Forrester, hire a consultant and tell you who can advise you. You can look in the Magic Quadrant, you can figure that out. We won't tell you that. But if you say, I have a problem that spans a environments, what are the right technologies necessary and how can they be put together and operated together? From an architectural perspective, that's what my little team does, and I think they do it exceptionally well. We've been doing it now for about 5 years. We've received, as you may have heard, the notice of intent to continue for the next 5. I've got some ambitions to make this thing far more public and far more, it's not inaccessible, but people just don't know about it. I sometimes think it's the best kept secret in Washington, D.C. For me personally, it's been a very interesting turn in my life to essentially turn from being a national security executive to running a couple of commercial cybersecurity companies to now operating again entirely in the public interest, but this time essentially trying to provide cybersecurity not for necessarily the Cyber Command or NSA, but for the small and medium-sized businesses that encompass the bulk of the economy of the United States. I wouldn't say necessarily that they've been left out, but to a certain extent they've been left out of the discussion, and they operate in the same cyberspace as everybody else. And I think that cyberspace has become somewhat more dangerous, and this is the contribution I'm trying to make. All right, before we go to the panel, I'll take some questions. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for your presentation of the graph. And I wanted to bring your attention to the information blocking rules that have been proposed by OMC, CMS, and since we are talking about health, cyber, and security and privacy. One of the exceptions from this general prohibition of information blocking is if a health IT developer or health information exchange healthcare provider is seeking to promote security, they can effectively block an exchange of data. So for me, it calls to mind the need to promote standards around cybersecurity so that there is actually some objective way of evaluating that blocking behavior or not. And by the way, there's absolutely legitimate reasons given the absence of that standard, applied standardization. So it seems like your Center of Excellence would play a really strong contributing role in that area.
That's an excellent, I want to thank you, Jill. That's an excellent comment and one I had not thought to make. My response is, I think you're absolutely right. And at a more general level, one of the persistent complaints that I've heard in my career in cybersecurity is that, what's the term politicians use? Unfunded mandates. You have to meet this standard. You have to do this thing. You've got to be able to achieve some sort of standard, but nobody tells you how, and certainly nobody tells you how to pay for it. So one of the things in essence that I try to do, and I'm trying to do it right now in the defense industrial base, where there are thousands of companies being told you have to meet 800 171 standards, but they don't know how to do it and they can't afford it. So they tell us. And I get it. So one of the things that we're trying to do in that space, in the healthcare space, and with managed security services providers is start to bend that cost curve down to the point where standards are something that people can actually afford to meet, because we agree with them. We think, in essence, that's the right way to go. But setting a standard that nobody can achieve, or only the largest providers can achieve, but others cannot, I think doesn't make a great deal of sense. It's aspirational. It may be even sort of what do they say, tastes great, less filling, but it doesn't mean anything. So that's the direction in which we've been trying to go. I think I can do one more before we start the panel. Is that right? Yes, sir.
So just to kind of piggyback off your question, my name is Tom from CMS. You know, most recently I sent back some comments to NIST about kind of the expense of some of the standards they were putting in for our latest release, and kind of the comments that came back was, well, that's why there's tailoring, and that the standards were just going to stand. And so there really didn't seem to be any kind of consideration of cost or the bend on certain standards. It was pretty much a, you know, we give you the standards. There's really no levels. There's no bronze, silver, gold kind of thing. It's just, here's the way to make, you know, your particular brick stronger, your concrete better, your protections harder. But it's up for you to figure out how you want to tailor those. But on the flip side, as soon as there's a breach, everybody's asking, why didn't you go to the gold standard? Platinum, I guess.
Well, let me answer that in two parts. Let me first give you the coward's answer. And that is, we don't work with a part of NIST that sets standards. We're working with a part of NIST that's trying to help people achieve them. So I can't speak to whether or not the standards are reasonable. But having said that, I sympathize with the problem because, you know, I've been in the cybersecurity business on the commercial side and run a couple of these businesses, and I know it can be hard. What we're trying to do, I think, is a step in the right direction. I mean, overall, the sort of the guiding light, our North Star is the cybersecurity is the CSF, the NIST cybersecurity framework, which really does give a sort of incremental approach to going up a level to being able to achieve incrementally higher levels of cybersecurity. The architectures that we're developing are, as implemented, intended to provide incremental improvements in cybersecurity. One doesn't have to do it all at once. So that's the approach that we're attempting to take, and I agree with you. I've recently heard the complaints of particularly smaller companies and the commercial side. This happened not to be in healthcare, but in the defense industrial base. We're not talking about Lockheed or Boeing. We're talking about the 300-person company that makes some bearing for a wheel well in a fighter plane. And they're looking at this and saying, how do I do this? And so we're trying to work, and we've been working pretty actively now with the managed security services business. I used to run one, and it was frankly too expensive for smaller customers. So that's the direction in which we're going. All right.